Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. It's always a pleasure to welcome Joe Emersberger back to Wider View. Joe is based in Windsor, Ontario, and writes exclusively on Latin America, especially Latin American political issues. And I began by asking Joe about the current events in Bolivia, where President Evo Morales has been forced to resign, and the U.S. has recognized Janine Áñez, a basically unknown member of parliament who proclaimed herself president. And Trump and other U.S. officials have hailed this as a return of democracy to Bolivia. So I asked Joe, what's really going on there?
Evo Morales won the election with 47% of the popular vote, of the votes counted, on a turnout of 88%. So that means he got roughly double the percentage of eligible voters that U.S. presidents typically get in any election. Mm-hmm. And that's actually low for him, because last time he was elected, he got actually 61% of the popular vote. So, I mean, after 13 years in office, it's very hard to sustain the same, even despite he's done great with the economy. So he's done tremendous achievements in reducing poverty, keeping inflation low, all sorts of very good progress since he was first elected in 2006. So he's achieved a lot. He has tremendous popular support. But his fatal error was letting the OAS bureaucrats anywhere near this election. I mean, they tuned the most free and fair election Haiti ever had in the last 20 years was in 2000. They impugned that election. That led to U.S. sanctions. That led to a U.S. perpetrated coup. U.S. troops actually kidnapped the president of Haiti. And then again, in 2011, they intervened in the election again, changed the results with any justification whatsoever. So they're a corrupt outfit. They're 60% funded by the United States government. They should not be allowed anywhere near elections. So why did he even let them get involved? Well, I mean, the United States does not need, and his opponents in Bolivia obviously do not need much of a pretext to say that he's rigging it. They just have to scream fraud, right? Which is what they did. So if he doesn't let them in, then they're going to say it's rigged. If he does let them in, well, then these guys are corrupt, and they'll find totally bogus reasons to declare the. So it was a dilemma for him. He probably calculated that his popular support and his achievements would overcome their level of corruption. Back last time, when he had so much even more popular support, probably his margin of victory would have been too large for even the OAS to negate. But this time around, things were a little tighter. He needed over 40% and a 10-point margin to avoid a runoff, and he just barely got that. So the OAS immediately started to confuse people about what was going on. And thank goodness for the Center for Economic and Policy Research. They did a really great deep dive into the election, into the intricacies of it. Now Bolivia is suffering the consequences. One of the key talking points in the media for people try to justify this is to say, well, Evo Morales lost a referendum in 2016. So in 2016, the public voted by 51% to 49%. To say no to Morales' proposal to abolish term limits, not just for the presidency, but for all elected officials. So then in 2017, again, the elected Supreme Court, they have elected Supreme Court in Bolivia. It knocked down the referendum, knocked down the results of the referendum. It said, that no, the term limits are not okay under our constitution and under international treaties. It's a violation of a person's human right to say they can't stand for office as many times as they want, and the people impose the term limits. Now, I do not support term limits. I think they're stupid, especially when you have these unelected power brokers in any typical society like the media, big business, who are not subject to elections, never mind term limits. I find that ruling debatable, but it's not an outrageous ruling. I mean, when you think of outrageous rulings, I think Citizens United. I think
right.
I think of the ruling that gave Bush the election in 2000, or even more dramatic is the ruling of the Honduran Supreme Court in 2009 that criminalized, basically sparked a coup, because they ordered the military to arrest Manuel Zelaya because he wanted to ask the public a question, a non-binding vote that
right.
And it wasn't even about term limits. There was a lot of lying. I mean, those were outrageous. Those were outrageous rulings. And the other thing point too is suppose it had been the other way around. Suppose Morales had won that referendum by 2 points, abolished the term limits. I find it hard to believe, given everything that's happened. The military basically putting a gun to the head of Morales, and all this violence, all his house being ransacked, he's being threatened, driven out of the country. All this violence, all the white supremacy that you see in his opponents and everything. This deep hatred of the indigenous people that they're expressing, very openly. All these things. I mean, this points to grave issues there. I don't think him winning that referendum by 2 points would have changed anything.
No, and you're getting into an area that I wanted to make sure we covered, which is talking about who these people are that first of all did the demonstrations that, at least according to mainstream media, are what's behind him resigning. But also, we're seeing images of Christian fascists, and there's something about removing Pachamama, which is basically a racist actions against the indigenous people of Bolivia, is it not?
Of course, yeah. Well, yeah, it's the power brokers, the real movers and shakers behind the opposition to Morales is this guy Camacho, he's an evangelical Christian fanatic. He's basically super right wing. The woman who just proclaimed herself president. First of all, I couldn't be more ridiculous, and it really infuriates me when people even bring up term limits and crap like that. When you see her declare herself president in front of like somebody said, there are probably more people in the cafeteria of the legislature at that time than there were in the actual legislature. The majority of representatives are with Morales, and they're basically in hiding, So it's such a travesty. And she's declared herself president, and Trump has recognized her because he's Trump. It's a deeply racist. Obviously, the driving force behind the opposition is racist. With any opposition, I just mentioned that Morales got 47% of the vote, which is incredibly high compared to most people, presidents in, for example, the United States. But even if you have let's say 10-20% support, especially if it's hardcore support, you can always put lots of people in the street and lots of people who hate the president in the street. I'm sure you can do that in the United States. And imagine if the United States, everyone who hated a president, the police and the military basically winked at them and just basically let them know openly that, hey, you want to go after them or anybody who supports them, we're not going to get in your way. You can imagine what would happen. And you can mobilize them, get them in the streets, and then with the military and police winking at them, they can cause all kinds of mayhem, and then say, well, and then try to pass it off as a popular uprising, and just ignore the fact that really, the reason this is happening is because the guys with the guns basically just decided, hey, we're gonna change the government.
And what I'm seeing too, I don't know if you've been following some of the Twitter action this afternoon and this evening, but there's a lot of counter protests now of where the supporters of Evo Morales are now in the streets. The members of the movement for socialism, his party, are not really permitting a quorum in the legislative assembly. There are now actions against this coup. Morales, of course, has fled to Mexico, probably, in fear of his life.
And his family.
Yeah, and his family, because the violence against Morales supporters is reminiscent of the coming of the Pinochet government in Chile. It's that bad. What are the forces that are at work right now in Bolivia that might overturn this? Or
there's obviously mobilizations. They're obviously not going to lie down and take it. I don't know at what point they could turn things around. I don't know, but they're definitely not going to make it easy for them to take their democracy away. He got 47% of the vote. Like I said, that's a lot of people. They're not just going to go away. Two questions obviously come up is, can they reverse it? But the other question too that's very frightening is, well, how much blood do they spill to consolidate this? Like all coups, of course, they immediately make sure that there's a monoculture in the media. They chase the state media. Anybody who supports Morales, they just basically chase them off the air to make it difficult for information to get out about what's happening in the country. That's the other issue. How much can they get away with to consolidate the coup? That's to me a very frightening question. Yeah, sure, I'd like to see the coup reversed, but the other frightening question is how much blood do they spill to consolidate? So then you mentioned Pinochet. The advice they always give to to dictators ever since the time of Machiavelli. The advice they always gave to people who seize power is get your killing with over with quickly, and consolidate quickly and very ruthlessly and get it over with. Don't drag out, don't drag, pacify people right away. So the coming weeks, months, crucial.
The other thing I wanted to cover, this is really like one of a number of Latin American countries that are currently in some kind of state of flux politically. Ecuador, the near neighbor of Bolivia, the Lenin Moreno government, which came to power in an election, but really by essentially deceiving the people into thinking they were going to continue the policies of Rafael Correa. And now there were protests in Ecuador against the Moreno government. What's your take on what's going on there? I know you've been involved a lot there.
Lenin Moreno, yeah, like you said, he basically did an amazing con job on everybody. He praised Correa. He was part of Correa's government. He was vice president for 6 years, then special envoy to the UN for the remaining 4. Correa was in office for 10 years. And now Correa also abolished term limits. A similar maneuver to what Morales did. He went to the Constitutional Court in this case, and they ruled that they were against the international treaties they had signed. So he did a similar thing, but Correa, he decided, it's probably best if I step aside. He said for personal reasons, he was going to step aside. He was basically said, I followed him very closely. I think he really wanted to just pass it on, and just he was tired. He wanted just to get out of politics. I really think he was honest when he said that. Mm-hmm. And he tried. And ironically, though, that decision didn't work out for him, because now he's got like 20, they have 20 investigations against him. They're going out. It's a nightmare scenario for them, where the guy who got in after, just immediately as soon as he took office, just flipped 180 degrees and went against everything he claimed to ever to stand for. I mean, just recently, for example, one of the reasons Morales had a tough time getting out of Bolivia was Mexico had to negotiate with all these right-wing governments now whose airspace they could fly over. And Ecuador was one of the governments that refused to allow them to fly over their airspace. So it's become basically a hard right, super cynical government, and like it doesn't get the same attention as Bolsonaro's. But I mean, just recently with the protest, they imprisoned the governor of the sitting governor, just recently elected months ago, the sitting governor of the second largest province, Pichincha. She's in jail. They accused of rebellion. Other prominent Correa support, another assemblyman, Jofre Poma, sitting assembly, were in jail. Virgilio Hernandez, a former National Assembly member, in jail. There's Magdalena Robles, online journalist, part of Correa's, in jail. You can just go on and on. I mean, their vice president was jailed a few years ago on a totally very flimsy, very suspect case. Just trampling over everything. I mean, if you follow the Assange case, he turned over Assange. He turned his stay in the embassy into a harsh prison sentence, and then turned him over, claiming he was smearing feces on the. He just made up stuff that was just outrageous. I mean, he's just a very cynical liar, hard right politician, just a disgrace. And so that's one of the allies this government will probably have if this sticks. That's one of the allies. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and these governments are much harder for left-wing groups to overthrow, because unfortunately the left-wing groups do not get lots of money from the National Endowment for Democracy, and generally have the School of the Americas training army officers to support them. So we have a little bit of a problem there.
Also, I have a piece coming out in Counterpunch, where I'm basically saying, look, just oppose the coup, never mind your critiques. It's basically the title of the piece. And a few things I mentioned, people say, oh, Morales made a bad move because he shouldn't have run. First of all, as you see in Correa's case, appointing a successor, given the difficulties and the pressures under left-wing governments, that doesn't always work out very well, No. So appointing a successor, that could be dangerous, the other danger too is, okay, like with the military. Oh, he didn't have the military under control. Okay, so what are we supposed to do? Get like Maduro, get the Cubans in there to help him out, which Maduro has, Chavez has. I mean, they have helped, but of course that opens them up to allegations and hysterical denunciations that we're just puppets of the Cubans or whatever. Because it's one way to break up the monopoly or the United States has. Is to use other countries to help you out, right? So, but then if you that also can be seen as a provocation, or to your opponents locally and internationally, to the United States, basically, And another thing, the other thing is, well, why didn't he, arm more of his supporters? Form militias, try to arm people so they can resist the police or the military if they take over. Again, obviously that opens them up to all sorts of allegations. You look at Nicaragua, where armed supporters basically fought off the coup. And it probably, I'm sure committed atrocities, but we're also fighting back against them as well, because I mean the so-called peaceful opposition in Nicaragua, they blocked up to 70% of the roads by their own admission for months. I mean, go try to block 70% of the roads in the United States. Think about how armed and dangerous you would have to be to block 70% of the roads in the United States and pull it off for months. I mean, you'd have to have some real serious firepower behind you to pull that off. I mean, that alone tells you these guys were violent and they were dangerous. But if you fight back, you get tagged with repressive. You're a dictator. You get tagged with sanctions. You get threatened with like Venezuela, threatened with invasion. So there's always, like you say, there's tremendous challenges for any left-wing government. That a right-wing government, Lenny Moreno, he could throw his opponents in jail, shoot protest, whatever, no problem.
I'm ever hopeful that somehow some of the left groups in Latin America will be successful. I mean, we've got movements in Brazil now, and Argentina, and Chile also. People struggling against the pro-U.S. elites, and we can always be hopeful that they'll have some luck.
Sure, but also, we can also, we live in Canada. Canada totally goes along with the United States and Latin America. They're just a total lapdog, because and they have major mining interests and everything in Latin America, so they benefit from the U.S. approach to Latin America for sure. And but we don't. We can do more than hope. We can actually be useful, because we can push back against all the disinformation that really facilitates this tremendously. It's so easy for our governments to support these horrible things because they don't get enough pushback from us. In the United States, they don't get the pushback from Sanders. I mean, even Sanders, in my opinion, probably the best politician the United States has. You could debate maybe Ilhan Omar, but they're just not good enough on foreign policy. They just don't. They don't have the information, and I think actually in Sanders' case, to be honest, I don't think he has the courage to push back the way he should on policy.
No, I tend to agree with you. I mean, I was reading an article recently that made the point that the things that we are arguing over the most in the presidential campaign, particularly on the Democratic side, are domestic policy issues in which a president really cannot effect change on his own or her own. I mean, they all require congressional approval, such as healthcare, tuition-free college, or whatever. All these issues require congressional approval, which would be very difficult to do even if the Democrats regain control of both houses, because they aren't going to be progressive Democrats, they're just going to be Democrats. One thing that presidents can do is foreign policy, and we tend not to even discuss it. At least in this election, we are discussing it.
That's a good point. A lot of times the Congress doesn't do much about foreign policy because they don't want to, and the president runs roughshod. But you're right, like the executive order, for example, imposing sanctions on Nicaragua and on Venezuela right now, that's something Sanders could commit to say, look, I'm trashing that. That's nonsense. Under U.S. law, how can it be legal to declare a totally bogus national emergency? I mean, officially declare Venezuela and Nicaragua an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. Yeah, exactly. That's what we should all do. Laugh. It's nonsense. It can't be. How can it be legal to lie so blatantly like that? We need people to push back and say, that cancel that executive order imposing, that to facilitate saying that's something they could easily do with the president who wanted to be progressive at all.
Right. There's a lot of things they could do right away. Yeah, there's so much with with Latin America particularly, this is not new. We're seeing essentially a continuation of what has been U.S. policy. I suppose we could say back to the Monroe Doctrine, but this is total neocolonialism. This is all this really is.
For sure. And it's like I said, when you have, can you imagine it, poor Morales had to rely on his body 60% funded by the U.S. and have to basically do what they say, and agree to their ridiculous conclusions about his election. And even when he agreed to them, he was still overthrown, because he had said, okay, fine, we'll have new elections. They still overthrew him because what they wanted was to overthrow him. It was all just a big smoke and mirrors,
Mm-hmm.
But he has to rely on this body that's 60% funded to tell him whether his election's okay. You can imagine if the United States had to rely on a 60% Putin-funded body to say whether your election is okay.
That'd be good, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Now, that would be a real Russiagate. That would be something real.
Yeah. Venezuela has managed to have their elections certified by other entities, whether it's the Carter Center, I know, and I think some UN bodies.
Yeah, they've had other international observers, but in the Western media, they haven't been given any credit, and they still just casually claim, oh, the election was fraudulent. Maduro won the last election by like 4 million votes. There's no basis for saying he was. Now, mind you, one of the reasons he won was because the opposition decided to boycott, because they preferred the boycott and just to try to delegitimize the election. And also what they won't admit is that the last time the opposition actually tried to contest election, they lost in 2017. The governor elections, they participated, they lost. But there's no basis for saying that election was fraudulent. That's just nonsense. They get the 50 countries, 50 countries or so out of 180 or so part of the UN, and the media talks that up as if it were the entire world. But the reason that suffered a big blow recently when Venezuela got voted onto the UN's Human Rights Council.
And that's a whole other issue we could get into. Is I think to some extent Trump, as the president, has diminished U.S. clout overseas and made U.S. hegemony perhaps a little less strong than it was before, because we can't pretend that the U.S. is a good partner that will work with you.
But I think that personally, I thought that Trump would do a lot more damage. I'm surprised by how little damage he's done to U.S. Aggression abroad. I thought it would really impede them much more. But what I should have seen, I guess he should have anticipated, is that the allies like Canada, like Spain, other countries, they really step up. When the United States loses credibility, the other allies step up and try to fill the gap and so people could say, well, no, it's not just the United States, it's also Canada, it's also perfect example is that, well, in Venezuela right now, they could say, well, it's not just Trump, look at that nice guy Trudeau or that nice guy, Macron or whatever. They try to work that way. But also in Haiti in 2004, George W. Bush at that time was deeply discredited over Iraq. And, but he was still able, one of the reasons he was able to pull off the coup was because he had the support of Canada and France kind of act as, provide him that cover.
Thanks very much. I appreciate your doing this.
Okay, it's been nice talking to you. Thank you.
All right, good. Thank you very much, Joe. Appreciate it. Thanks again to Joe Emersberger for joining me this week on Wider View. The views expressed here are those of myself and my guests, to provoke you to think outside the box and to question the narratives you get from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we have succeeded. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.